All right, thank you very much. We have a very special guest today, Dr. Christopher Mott. He's a Washington Fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. That's a North American international relations political science think tank. And I came to know about Chris from a very, very good article that he wrote about woke imperium, the coming confluence between social justice and neoconservatism. In my view, that's actually the best leftist critique of wokeism that I read. But there are many other very interesting texts that you can find on Chris' website. That is, on the one hand, on the website of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, but then also on the blog that Chris has. And we'll share links to those in the description of this video. The main theme today is going to be democratism. That's an interesting term for what could probably be called a new civil religion in the West, which is based on some form of idealized, almost metaphysical reference for democracy. But before we do this, I'd like to ask Chris, we're recording this on November 7th. Chris, I'd like to ask you on your opinion on the election in the US, which just took place.
Yes. I don't really have a super strong opinion because I was prepared to not be really happy with either outcome. It's a position where I've had for the last at least three prior presidential elections, and then this one too. The options that we're given are quite limited when it comes to major party choices. And I am technically someone that they should want to court because I'm an independent who lives in Pennsylvania. And and so
Right.
if they should be trying to appeal to me, right? And they never do. There's always something to, and I'm not finicky. I don't believe in moral, litmus tests that are strident or perfectionism or anything like that. But there's just very, very few basic red lines that it's very hard for the two-party system to meet. And I think there's a lot of people that feel that way. That being said, the not very surprising outcome of this election, I think, is a repudiation of not just the Democratic Party. I think that might be too superficial of a explanation, but rather a repudiation of bipartisanship as it's understood from the centrist neoliberal wings of both parties. We saw the Harris campaign, which had the huge advantage of having Trump had a prior record as president. It wasn't a very good one.
No.
He was behaved very embarrassingly on January 6th. He had many disastrous policies. They could have pointed to any of that and then gone in a more positive direction. And especially in differentiating themselves from the largely discredited and potentially senile Biden administration. But there was no differentiation whatsoever. Not only that, there was a doubling down on many of the worst aspects of the Biden administration, particularly when it came to Middle East policy. And
Right.
I think that this, combined with a typical in recent decade kind of a democratic fixation on kind of acting like corporate HR
Exactly.
in how they deal with voters, I think this doomed them. It wasn't obvious. I think until the night of the election, it was very much a coin toss, and I wouldn't want to retroactively deny that. That's how I felt too. But I could kind of feel, even though I thought there was a good chance that Harris would win the Electoral College, I did think that even if that happened, Trump would win the popular vote based off of rural turnout in particular. And the reason I thought this is because no one addresses the concerns of people who are outside kind of the big media markets. And they feel neglected and they're annoyed. And I think they have every right to be. I don't think that their
Yeah.
proposed solutions are always great, but they have a right to be mad. And there's been this attempt ever since 1992 of the Democratic Party under Bill Clinton then to pivot away from working class roots and into a kind of perpetual yuppiedom, the kind of
Right.
Patrick Bateman's of the world, right? It's all these very affluent urban professionals, and they've done that, and that's been good for their fundraising. That's been good for their donor money, but it has actually hollowed out much of their base. And it's interesting that
Yes.
you're always told that Trump is this racist, fascist caricature. But he is more than any president since like probably Calvin Coolidge, who has been a Republican ticket, been constantly making gains with minorities. And in this election, more than
Mm.
any other, he has gained so much, particularly with Hispanics who are supposed to be, he's supposed to hate. He's gained so much with them. The data is pretty decisive, actually. That it's obvious that the attempt to play racial identity politics has failed utterly, and it was mostly an attempt by liberals and the center left to do this. And it's actually the right who seems to be building a more multi-class, multicultural coalition. I don't want to overstate that because who knows what will happen in 4 years, but it just goes to show no one has a lock on minority votes. And taking them for granted is a huge disaster. So whenever people say, and I'm sure there will be people with very basic takes from all over the world saying that Kamala Harris lost because she's a woman and because she has multiple minority ethnic backgrounds, that's absolutely BS. That's not true at all. Many of the regions, including my home state, that voted for Trump won multiple times voted for a guy named Barack Hussein Obama 7 years after 9/11. I don't think that that's true at all. So I think what we're really seeing is just identity politics, particularly postmodern identity politics, have failed. Their alliance with neoliberal capital has failed, and the
Right.
Democratic Party is so divorced of an actual natural constituency that all it has is its media control and its ability to shape narratives. But those media
Right.
apparatuses, as we know, are totally distrusted by everyone. So they really have to reinvent themselves. And I think if this isn't a wake-up call, I don't know what is. But they should have had this wake-up call in 2016, and all they did was double down into Russiagate conspiracy theory to cover for themselves. So I don't have any faith that they will necessarily learn this time either.
Thanks for this very blunt assessment, Chris, which I basically share 100%, I have to say. Um, the point of our conversation, though, today is not this directly political theme, but we want to dig a little deeper and talk about this notion of democratism and what's problematic about it. And I guess maybe the major problem you've already mentioned somehow in your analysis of the election, namely that democracy is actually not as democratic as it describes itself, right? I mean, we just have the curious fact that you also outlined right at the beginning when you analyzed the election that, and I guess you spoke for many people, that you didn't really like any of the two options that were out there. And so it's not really the case that democracy gives the people the choice to, elect the leader they want and to elect the government that they want. That seems to be like obvious, particularly regarding this election. But of course, generally, I mean, this view that the will of the people decides about the government, and then that this democratic government that represents the will of the people kind of steers all of society uh, towards the direction that the people desire. This doesn't seem to be a very good description of how society in general functions today in the 21st century, and also not even how politics function. And yet we cling to this notion of liberal democracy, which functions, I would say, and I'm also relating this to your writings, uh, almost like a religion, right? I mean, traditional religions in the past, they were not very good description of how the world works. And I'm afraid that the civil religious belief system that we could call democratism also doesn't really describe the social and political reality that we live in very well. Um, yeah, so in relation to this, could you outline this notion of democratism
Yeah,
and your
so
take on it?
Right, yeah, sure. I can't take credit for coining the phrase entirely. The phrase is actually coined by a scholar named Emily Finley in her very excellent book, probably my favorite book on political theory from the past 10 years, The Ideology of Democratism, where she lies out a kind of genealogy of related, not necessarily all identical, but related thought. That starts in her narrative with Jean-Jacques Rousseau and continues on throughout the Enlightenment, where liberal democracy is viewed by certain scholars as a kind of missionary creed, a kind of replacement civil religion, where the nature of society and the state is to promote democracy for the purpose of teleology, in effect, to bring about a kind of end state where everyone is free. Now, how do you do this in a world where lots of people have different societies and different opinions? Well, democracy, ironically, has to be managed by a professional class. You might even say a proto-professional managerial class,
Right.
who knows and it truly believes in it and spreads its values throughout society. And also, I think this is key for both Fenley's narrative and why I find it so useful myself as an IR person. I think she's a theorist in general, but not an IR person, is that this has to be spread abroad, right? So it's not just good enough that a society has a managed democracy to bring about the best in people. It has to be exported so that one day the world can entirely be free, and in so doing, can then become truly democratic. And of course, the problem with this is that people largely don't like kind of yes, there's historical periods where people like missionary crusades, of course. There's times where it becomes popular. But in the long run, people don't want a sustained war society forever. And democratism says, no, you should have one because eventually we'll all be democracies. And then democratic peace theory takes over and we won't have to fight any wars anymore. And then the managerial class element can be stepped back, and we really truly can be free and democratic. But until then, everything is managed, everything is kind of curtailed around this consensus. Ironically, it can lead to censorship and one-party rule and what have you, because it's meant to keep the society going, even when it doesn't want to be constantly expanding, even when it doesn't want the managerial class running everything. So, ironically, the kind of this faith in democracy leads to a very anti-democratic worldview, which I think we see reflected in many people who are kind of, I would say these days would describe themselves as anti-populist, and very like pro-elite, which is not to say that, elites don't have a purpose. I personally believe that every society creates elites inevitably. It's
Right.
just a question of how capable those elites are and what they believe in. And if what they believe in is kind of a militarized exportation of liberal values, then they are believing in something that I would contend is faith-based and not based in rationality. Because this is not actually democratic peace theory, in my opinion, and my background is in history long before I came to international relations. I just don't think it's true. I don't think the democratic peace theory holds much water. It's entirely based on the fact that we have a quote unquote post-war order, which first of all is clearly not permanent because it's been breaking down since the Great Recession. But even aside from that, you're taking a very, very tiny percent of world history, like an infinitesimally tiny percent of world history, and saying that because no two democracies have fought each other in this time period, therefore democracies will never fight each other. I can think of many democracies in history that did fight each other. Many democratic Greek city-states that waged wars of extermination against each other. Rome and Carthage were both republics. The War of 1812 between the United States and Britain. The Quasi-War, which, although unofficial, was the United States' first war with a foreign European power, was actually with revolutionary France, which 10 years ago had been its ally. Um, but there is evidence, no more evidence to me that democracies don't fight each other than there is evidence that monarchies don't fight each other, which is obviously untrue. And the whole reason that we've seen this period of stability in modern history is because of all the developed democracies that appear to be allied and have good relations. it's very clear that one of them is far more powerful than the others, and that ultimately it holds disproportionate sway, and therefore there is no rivalry between democracies. But in a counterfactual, if the Soviet Union had been a fully democratic multi-party state in the Cold War, I don't think that would have changed the Cold War one bit, because it wouldn't have
Mm.
changed the nature of a security dilemma between superpowers.
Right.
So, which is the ultimate thing, right? So to me, Finley might disagree because her and my opinions, I don't think are the same. I'm much more of a materialist, but to me, the material factor is what matters. And a society's capacity for potential power kind of dominating other societies, which is founded mostly in material reality, is going to determine who rivals who and who is subordinate to who. And so I do not believe the style of government that is held by multiple countries is actually all that relevant when it comes to diplomacy. But the democratists would say that is untrue. Nothing matters more. And in modern day phrase, these people are mostly, of course, members of the neoconservative movement. Or if they're slightly less warlike, but they're really into globalized economics, they are neoliberals economically.
Right.
And that, of course, is the political center of much of the developed world. And so much of the rhetoric we get has this intrinsic democratist vibe. Now
Yes.
in Finley's uh, telling of it, it starts with Rousseau, but it has multiple permutations. Its first American permutation is Thomas Jefferson, who believed in an empire of liberty. And its most, I think, relevant example of someone taking it from theory to practice, much to the detriment of many people, I would say, is Woodrow Wilson.
Hmm.
Um, and I think it's not coincidental that the two presidents who most espoused this view in U.S. history were Woodrow Wilson and George W. Bush, both of whom were the two most religious people ever to hold
Right.
executive office. So you have an element of strident faith here. And I
Yes.
think but it's sold as rational, not by everyone, of course, but by many people, particularly, I would say, the center left. Uh, uh, and the straight up center, right? The kind of Steven Pinker type people,
Right.
they see this as the way to bring humanity forward. But what's happening now is the world is increasingly multipolar. That means there's multiple powerful countries. The U.S. cannot dictate to everyone all the time. And so people are saying, well, if we're powerful now and we don't have to listen to everything that is comes from the North Atlantic, why wouldn't we organize our power politics around different values? You know, why wouldn't we say something else? In the end, it's power determines who is right and who is wrong and who's how far you can go with it. And so democratism is actually, I would say, a danger because it represents a worldview that not only is not true, but spreading it is just completely contrary to the present geopolitical situation, which is one of divergence.
Right. I want to get back to this in a minute, but yeah, I really want to focus on the internal, let's say, paradoxes or dialectics of democratism. One is, I guess, uh, the illiberality. The liberalism becomes illiberal. And I have one core quote here from one of your texts. Only the democratists themselves can govern policy because only the mission of democratization is a legitimate purpose for a government. So it's this kind of claim to a kind of monopoly on power that all other kinds of if you're not 100% democratist, then you're somehow not qualified, then you're to govern. I want to give just briefly like three maybe example for this increasing trend towards illiberalism in liberalism. One is, and you and I both wrote about this, the shift towards this kind of cancel culture oriented wokeism, right? Which you also feel in academia, I guess. I think a lot of academics now operate with a significantly increased degree of self-censorship.
Probably
Um,
more than any other profession right
yes,
now.
yes, yes. And then we see also, at least in Germany, I'm not so sure about the US, very much increased media uniformity, where the mainstream media just like basically adhere to a very strong democratist orthodoxy. Which, by the way, again, talking about Germany, leads to the fact I read this statistics not long ago that about 50% of Germans now think they can't really say what they think anymore in public freely, which is very strange. Like, I mean, I left Germany 25 years ago and there was no problem regarding this, but the social climate has significantly changed. And also, again, talking about Germany, maybe more than other countries, the exclusion of parties that seem to be somehow suspicious and not 100% democratist, which are then labeled as somehow undemocratic and kind of systematically kept out of government. So on all these three levels, we can see what I find a kind of worrying dialectical trend of liberalism becoming illiberal. And that seems to me to be directly related to this phenomenon of democratism, namely that the belief in democracy becomes a kind of a religious faith. Can you maybe talk about that a little more?
Yeah, I think that liberal political philosophy arose for very specific reasons in the 17th, 18th century that are very logical. I mean, I critique liberalism, but I describe myself not as anti-liberal, but as post-liberal in the sense that there's actually a lot of good in liberalism. I take quite a bit of it. I like the U.S. Bill of Rights a lot. I like the First Amendment a lot. I like the idea of constitutional government. Like there's a lot that's cool. But those things always arose in the context that they were aiding society, right? They were not society itself. The social contract was not the end all be all.
Mm,
And so I think this liberalism has arisen, which pretends, I don't think it has succeeded in this, but it pretends it's totally divorced from culture and geography and history. And it merely exists as a Platonic ideal.
mm,
And therefore, it's an absolutist creed, and you either believe it or you don't. And there are only individuals, therefore, who are being mediated through the ether of liberalism, and nothing else, right? And that, to me, is just a weirdly unnatural way of how humans interact and how society
mm.
functions.
Right. It's a kind of fundamentalism.
Yes, well, that's the thing. It reminds me a lot of fundamentalist religions, and
Yeah.
particularly religions that have a very intolerant attitude towards other religions.
Right. Yeah. I
So
mean, again,
so
that's kind of the irony, right? Democratism is very much opposed against any kinds of fundamentalism and sees itself as the opposite. But the stronger this opposition goes, the somehow closer democratism itself becomes to another kind of fundamentalism.
yeah, absolutely. It's I don't think there ever was a huge break, honestly, between the kind of sectarian conflict that gave rise to some of these thoughts and these thoughts themselves. It's a very black and white worldview, but I think more pertinent to the concept of democratism itself, it's a worldview that says that human beings can be perfected through a kind of moral evolution, and that the state and
Right.
politics has a vital role to play in
Right.
that moral evolution.
Yes.
And I mean, I don't see there to be anything fundamentally wrong or right with the human race. I just see it as the human
Mm.
race. So to me personally, this is a baffling thing, but it's very appealing, I think, to people that were raised on the concept of, say, like original sin and like I don't know, perfecting yourself as a kind of example to others, right? And then spreading the good news, if you will. So
Yeah.
it is explicitly, and I would say too that while elements of liberalism have been successfully integrated into countries all around the world,
Yes.
the monadical forms of liberalism remain a very North Atlantic phenomenon, which
Mm.
strongly implies that there is a direct connection here, I would say, to the Protestant Reformation.
Yes.
And and when you look at the countries that are the most wokest, they are overwhelmingly the countries who have been prone in the past to evangelism, to various kind of Christian sectarian wars. I mean, I would say that there's probably these days Germany seems to be the wokest country, but
Mm,
I would say traditionally the U.S., Canada, the Scandinavian countries, they tend to be like. But what do all those countries have in common, right? That North Atlantic heritage of the strident taking a stand and
right.
very much kind of seeing the world as a moral playground
Yes.
to one's superiority.
Exactly, yeah. This is exactly the next topic that I wanted to talk about, the next kind of dialectical aspect of democratism or paradoxical aspect, the immorality of morality. Again, I have a few quotes from your text, three actually. The first one, short, where you talk about the missionary mentality of expansion of democracy. You also talked about this earlier. The second one is you talk about a global jihad for abstract universal values, along with clueless exhortations for values-based diplomacy. And then finally, you say that this contest for political power is a Manichaean struggle of good versus evil, which is existential rather than a clash of interest that could be solved by diplomacy. So all these three quotes basically speak to this very kind of extreme, almost moralism that, in fact, leads to a lot of problems, both internally and externally. The internal problem we already talked about, the exclusion of larger and larger segments of the population, which are somehow regarded as morally impure, and to kind of new divisions as we see in the culture wars, where this insistence on moralism actually, creates very strong social divisions. Because usually, if you immoralize your opponents, the opponents in turn also immoralize you.
Right.
So morality, as the sociologist Niklas Luhmann said, is very close to social conflict. The more morality you have, the more kind of in danger a society is to develop conflicts, potentially violent conflicts.
I
But
completely agree.
also then externally, what I've called the pariah principle, right? That the external agents are also no longer just regarded as other, but actually as evil others that you can't really even communicate with without kind of compromising democratism and kind of making yourself suspicious for, engaging with an evil other. And this, of course, leads to something like whatever, the death of diplomacy, right? In the 1970s, when I grew up in Germany, there was a strong emphasis on Entspannungspolitik, on détente. And now we have the same forces, like the Social Democrats and the Green parties, which grew out of the opposition movement in the 1970s. They are like the opposite of Entspannungspolitik, the opposite of détente, right? And they oppose even any attempts to engage in mediation, for instance, regarding the war in Ukraine, right? Mediation now appears has become a bad word, and then we have always this kind of accusation of appeasement. Appeasement also has become like a very bad word. So these are the problems growing out of this. I think the external problems growing out of this insistence on moralism, which then again dialectically becomes actually somewhat the opposite of moral. Can you maybe say
Yeah.
something about that?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, first I need to put the caveat in here that there are indeed cynical actors involved in this. These are not just starry-eyed idealists, although
Mm.
I'd say numerically there probably are more idealists than cynical actors. But cynical actors are the more important ones. They know that this is a good way to whip people up for a cause. They know this is a good way to make political hay. They know this is a good way to get media
Mm.
coverage. But it wouldn't work without lots of willing dupes. And there are lots of willing dupes. And the problem is some of these societies, North Atlantic, have been so prosperous for so long that they don't have to engage in like messy reality as much, or at least they don't think they do. So there's a kind of complacency there where people think that their values are the most important thing and not perhaps their strategy to react to things outside of values. And so we have now at least a couple generations have gone by where I think more and more of the political, economic, and media, especially elite, have recruited people that think like them at an increasingly uncritical rate, right? So maybe there was a bit more critical thought about this rhetoric before, when you had in the Cold War, when there was the reality of the perpetual nuclear standoff and whatnot. But the unipolar moment was really bad for people's brains, and not just in the U.S. I mean, in the allied world, shall we say? Maybe even more outside the U.S. because there's even more of a divergence from the messy realities of hard power, right? So you just have this belief, and this is one I came across when I lived in Europe for a time quite a bit, in the 2000s and early 2010s. You have this kind of strident, like, well, we're more evolved here. We've moved beyond, like
Yes.
war and power politics
Yeah.
and what. Why? Because you're lucky enough to live in an epoch where there's peace. I mean,
Right.
the Tokugawa shogunate had peace for 250 years. To me, it's just not a meaningful thing. But people genuinely believe this. And
Yes.
when the Ukraine war first broke out, there was a lot of European commentary that was like, can you believe this is happening in Europe?
Right.
As opposed to some other barbarian part of the
Exactly.
world.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, have you ever read European history? Of course I can believe this happens in Europe. But it's this complacency that has become self-referential to the point where even establishment institutions seem to believe their own BS, which I
Yes.
think is infinitely more dangerous than cynical calculation. Because
Right.
how do you reason with that, right? Like
Mm.
it's very hard to deprogram that kind of thinking. Now, the damage that this does, particularly to diplomacy, which is the thing that professionally I'm by far the most concerned with,
Mm.
is that it prevents people from understanding that the point of diplomacy is not to talk to your friends, it's to talk to people who are not your friends.
Exactly.
So you don't have to fight them all the time. You will always have to talk to people you don't like. You always have to talk to people who are weirdly different from you, culturally, politically, whatever. And it's good. It's not just you have to, it's good to talk to them. You never know what
Right.
you might learn. You might find out that they're doing something better than you. You might
Right.
find out that they're doing something horribly and you should never do that thing. But it's actually good that societies are different from each other. Like the
Right.
whole globalization project, which the democratist believes in, is actually detrimental because not, of course, it's ridiculous. It would never happen. But in a hypothetical world where they got their wish and everyone lived in, I don't know, global Sweden, whatever, we would lose the ability to compare contrast. We would lose the ability to learn from each other. It would be like every store being owned by the same company. There would be no testing of metal whatsoever. And the problem with the strident moralism of the types of people is not only do they want to do away with difference, but when they see difference, they're just disgusted by it. It's something to be looked down upon. It's something, oh, you can't negotiate with North Korea. That's North Korea. It's a very different society. And I'm like, why not?
Yeah.
Why not negotiate with North Korea? Every sustainable peace deal ever in world history and nothing lasts forever, of course. Everything is temporary. Everything is chaotic. We know that. But like it's impressive to get a peace deal that lasts 5 or more years. It's very impressive to get a peace deal that lasts generations.
Mm.
Every example of a successful peace deal were societies that were radically different from each other, learning to live with each other. That's modus
Right.
vivendi. Learn to accept that they're different and they get along anyway. And there is a
Right.
lesser form of this that is talked about by the philosopher John Gray, who I'm quite a big fan of.
Yeah, me
Um,
too.
yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
He talks about this also as important in domestic politics. In his very overlooked, but I think one of his best books, Two Faces of Liberalism, he talks a lot about how liberalism originally arose to combat sectarian chaos. And figures like Hobbes and Spinoza were kind of the original liberals, even though we don't always think of them that way now. And their whole point was that the state needs to just make sure that everyone gets along. But under the umbrella of the state, there's actually a huge variety of different people, different faiths that can live together. And the state is really a geographic entity. That's been replaced by this Kantian Rousseau liberalism.
Yes.
State is not a geographic entity. It has no limits. It only has values,
Yes.
and therefore it must expand and
Yes.
expand
It's very
fantastic.
Kantian, yes.
Yeah, or be
Both
destroyed, right?
ideas, both the foundation in, let's say, universal values, but then there's a universal aspect in it, right? Which means they have to be universalized. They have
Yes.
to. There's this globalist aspect that is very, very strongly ingrained in this belief that the system is kind of founded in reason only.
Yes. And of course, who's reason, right? Because like, look, I'm not a postmodernist, but I do think that morality is relative. There are many things that aren't relative, but morality is because it arises from places and times. There are differences in other societies. Why should everyone be North Atlantic? Why should everyone be Middle Eastern if you want to go back further?
Yeah,
You
and
know,
I mean
like
the irony, which you also addressed, Chris, sorry for interrupting you, is that we have this kind of, in disguise, a new emergence of a superiority complex of the civilized
very,
over the barbarians. That is, I
absolutely.
think, one of the greatest paradoxes here, right? That in the disguise of this universal post-colonialist uh, civil religion, there's a new form of of distinction between us and them, and between the civilized and the uncivilized.
Absolutely. And I think that this isn't even unprecedented because I think and I've brought up this comparison many times before, so I know I can kind of repeat myself, but I think it's a very cogent comparison. I actually think that like we saw the first trial run of this with the British Empire in the 19th
Right.
century, where you have a kind of super state that first wanted to make money and build its hard power, and so it did a lot to spread like, you know, the global slave trade around the world. But then when it industrialized and it didn't need to do that anymore and it was prosperous, it could
Right.
then turn around and say, now it's our job to go around the world and get rid of the slave trade. We're the great
Yes.
liberators. And they would then invade
Yes.
countries using
Yes.
this and take them over.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
This is now we see a version of this in the modern day with
Yeah, and
Samantha.
we also had at that time, I mean, we still had the traditional religion, which the contemporary civil religion just grew out of, namely Christianity, which was equally a universalist, moralist project with a very strong messianistic element to it. And
Well,
also,
in
again,
my
like this
yeah.
idea of universal reason somehow inherent in it.
I mean, in my kind of controversial personal opinion, that is where all this actually started.
Yeah, yeah,
Is the replacement of, you know, many ways of being as represented by many gods and many cults with a single universal god and a single universal cult and a single rule system, which of course still arose in a particular place in a particular time. And the further it goes from that particular place and time, the kind of weirder it becomes because it doesn't quite fit there. Like I feel like there is an ecological element to this, right? Like there's climate, there's weather, there's like what you eat and like how things grow. And the more you try to globalize a cultural thing, the more that innate connection to like land and physical reality deteriorates. And
yeah,
so you get just pure idealism. And I think this is part and parcel of Platonism. It's part and parcel of Abrahamic religion, and it has been passed down to people who view themselves as secular and rational. Um, and it's now part of liberal humanism. It is
yes,
specifically a part and now it's fundamental form of liberal humanism, which is wokeism.
yes,
These are, which is like the Reformation of of the Enlightenment, if you will.
yeah,
And so we are now seeing this, and the attempt is always to kind of push this onto people, not only so that the person doing the pushing can feel like a protagonist, and not only so that the person financing them can maybe open new markets to exploit, but also just as a kind of rallying cry, like we're really not that bad, we're different. When, you know, us in the present day, us in this society, we're actually better than all those other empires. We're a completely new thing, and all we do is try to make humankind better. And this is why you need to justify this defense spending budget or the ability not to negotiate with this country, because one day, you know, all of us will come together and we'll realize that, you know, we all need to be good Kantian liberals
yes,
with maybe now a postmodern edge to make it seem more multicultural,
yeah,
and that's all they want, really.
yeah. And I mean, at the core of this ideology of democratism seems something that also was developed clearly out of Christianity. The idea of a certain Menschenbild, a certain view of what the human being is essentially, namely the sovereign individual, the primacy of the sovereign individual, and this kind of teleological view that we have to increase individual autonomy, and that this is somehow what characterizes the human beings most fundamentally, that they become sovereign individuals. And again, my problem with that is not that it's not a beautiful vision, but it might not be the most realistic view of what humans actually are, and specifically not about how societies function. Neither small societies like small social networks like families and so forth or friends, but certainly not on a global scale. So I think that is an inherent problem of this civil religion of democratism, that at its core there is this teleological belief in sovereign individuality, which is neither very realistic nor very helpful for solving political and socio-political problems.
I can't think of a single society that was based around the individual. Like it just there are societies that claim to be, I'm not, but in actual practice, it just doesn't happen. It's not how we're organized, and so it's a very weird thing to want. And then you realize, well, if it's deeply unnatural, how would you bring it about? And the answer is you don't really it's you're really just replacing natural forms of community with stated ideological alliance networks. But most alliance networks are based off of like place or pragmatism. They're not based off of like ideology, right? And that becomes the problem both for domestic and foreign policy in general is if people view everything as the I'm this type of person, I need to be against that type of person. It
Right,
prevents them from making useful alliances or friendships or what have you with
right.
what's immediately available right at hand, which is how cultures naturally function. And so, I mean, I do feel that there is this, it's so weird. It creates these like hypocritical things. I mean, anyone who's ever met an anarchist, I mean, maybe not every single example, but in my personal experience, anarchists tend to be the most authoritarian people you'll ever meet. You know, they on the personal level, right? Because the only thing they have is ideological consensus. So everything has to be rigidly policed and they love like cancel culture and stuff, right? But if you meet someone who is like perfectly acceptable with like, well, it's not the greatest state ever, but the state works for me, and you know, there tends to be a more like laissez-faire attitude towards things, right? Like,
Mm.
you know, collectively we'll kind of figure it out eventually, whatever our disagreements are. So, I mean, there's a certain clarity, I mean, to people who have traveled in, you know, one-party states or like in states that aren't very politically free one does find, at least in my experience, there's a weird kind of honesty where like everyone knows the government lies, everyone knows it's
Exactly,
all
of
BS.
course.
Uh,
Of
yeah, and
course.
they can in
Yeah. I
private they
mean, like
often
here in
talk
China
very
too,
honest.
right? You have much more, let's say, uh, a healthy critical attitude towards the official discourse and towards the official media. And yeah, somehow that results in more healthy, at least to some extent, interactions between people,
Absolutely.
and a
Living
lesser sense of
comparatively.
superiority, and a lesser
Yeah.
sense of missionary zeal, and a more kind
I,
of tolerant, actually, paradoxically again, a more kind of tolerant attitude. For instance, among academia, I mean, I said this before, like I feel like, for instance, here in Macau, in many ways, there is much more intellectual and academic diversity than I remember from Germany.
I'm not surprised at all. I think that in societies where people are allowed to publicly be much more free, which by the way I totally support and think is cool. I have lots of unpopular opinions, so it works for me. But
Yeah.
in those societies, nevertheless, there is this tendency for groups, particularly, I would say, journalists and academics are at the top of that list, to ideologically self-police, right? To
Exactly.
differentiate themselves, and they usually do it by adopting some kind of strident kind of worldview where they're actually the protagonists of the universe, and
Yeah.
they're making everything better for all of us to stay the line, and they can use unofficial kind of backbiting methods to sabotage people that they don't like.
Right.
Uh, that's like cancel culture. That's like, um, all
Well,
of
I
these
mean,
things.
in my view, this has a lot to do with the shift towards what I like to call profile politics, right? That you succeed in society by uh, building certain profiles that are somehow popular, and these differ from system to system in which you operate. But particularly in academia and media, as you just said, certain profiles can easily become very unpopular. And then, of course, it helps if people actually build up what I call true investment in these profiles, right? If it's much easier to uh, parade a profile if you actually are truly invested in it, right?
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think that is what we clearly see, for instance, in academia, that people build true investment in successful profiles, and these profiles are very much streamlined.
Yeah, it seems like I was in academia for a little while, and then I haven't been in for about a decade now. And it seems like I got out right at the right time. I mean, like you, obviously, you were in China, so you haven't had to deal with the stuff that people in the North Atlantic have had to deal with. But it definitely seems like once I got out was when things got very, very bad, and there was a just moral panic everywhere.
Mm.
And I feel like the cause of the academic went from scholarship and enlightenment in the more general apolitical sense to one of being a missionary, right? To impart a certain set of values to students. And I mean, I don't know, like maybe I'm overreacting here, but if I had a college age child or about to be a college age child right now, I would 100% demand, if they want support for me, that they study somewhere outside of like the North Atlantic world. Because I just like under present circumstances, I just really would not trust A, the amount of money you would pay, and then
Mm.
B, it just seems like it's an ideological indoctrination more than it is a like build yourself up to be useful to society by being critical and somewhat set apart from society. And I think this actually kind of weirdly enough dovetails into our first point about the
Exactly.
election. The one demographic that the Democrats have been consistently gaining in the past few years has been people with graduate degrees. They've
Yes,
been
of
losing
course.
every other demographic that they gained
Exactly.
in that one. And
Yeah,
it's
but
like, oh,
interestingly, they're losing the younger generation, right?
yeah.
I found this a very interesting statistics that apparently the younger generation, um, I mean, these career academics that succeed, that is no surprise, right? That they are still kind of most attracted to what you called earlier, the established elites. Whereas young people who, face all kinds of difficulties, because there are not so many career paths open, there is not like great prosperity waiting around the corner for them, right? They become increasingly critical and of the dominant master narratives. And so I think the young people uh, are more critical than maybe the middle-aged and older generations towards democratism, both in its right wing and its left wing shape.
They've also seen, and this applies to me, even though I'm now no longer really a young person, I would say, but recently I guess I kind of was one. But I would say from my generation on down, there is also this. This is a very foreign policy point, but I think it's pertinent. We have never seen this mythologized liberal democracy promotion used for good.
Mhm.
I mean, like it's stated to be used for good. It benefits some people, mostly defense contractors. But
Right.
Like we have never seen it used for good. Now, I mean, like I said, my background's in history. I know that I can complicate that story. I know I can point to very specific examples where it did work out okay. But the overall point, when you look at a macro argument, is how frequently does it work out compared to how frequently does it not work out? And I think the case is clear. Democracy promotion is a disaster. It should never be a center point of anyone's foreign policy. Nation building in general is a disaster and only seems to work if you have a very specific set of circumstances, which are very unlikely to reoccur regularly, which is basically complete and total domination of another society through conventional war, and that society was already industrialized before, so, so it has the knowledge to rebuild without having to import colonists or whatever. I think that young people in particular, they have seen these record-breaking defense budgets. They have seen this democratist rhetoric. They have seen, what have they seen? It create refugee crises. They have seen it destabilize societies, state collapse, all kinds of problems. And I mean, if you want to look at, I would say the kind of person who most resembles this old school missionary meets modern day kind of woke crusader, I would say it's Samantha Power, the current head of the USAID and the former UN ambassador under the well, I think under Obama she had some other role and then she became UN ambassador, whatever. But she is the designer of the Responsibility to Protect doctrine, also known as R2P, where she looked at Rwanda and was horrified, then became an advocate for interventionism in the breakup of Yugoslavia. And then when she had influence with Obama, she said, you know, you can't stand by, you always have to intervene when something bad might happen. And this, of course, inspired the Libya intervention, which I would argue was just as disastrous as the Iraq War in terms of the effect it had on the world and many, many things. And an interesting thing, I think it's worth mentioning another scholar here, Philip Cunliffe. He wrote a book, Cosmopolitan Dystopia is the name of the book, arguing that R2P serves, no matter what their interests or their stated goals, serves interventionists very well because it so effectively destabilizes societies that it creates the condition for further responsibility to protect operations in the same region over and over and over again, meaning that there's a perpetual need for military interventionism wherever responsibility to protect is invoked. And I think this is kind of the ultimate goal of crusader ideology, whether it's religious or secular or what have you. It is to justify perpetual interventions. And the moralism clouds the fact that, oh, we might have actually done this before. We might have been this before, right? When's the last time you heard someone in the corporate press talk about, you know, why Libya is destabilized, like why there are all these refugee flows and slave markets even, like why are these things there? It gets memory hold that, you know, the mission to topple the Gaddafi government is actually the original reason why. Same too with spillover effects into other countries in the Sahel. Because the war did not just destabilize Libya. It's part of the reason that there's all this military conflict in countries like Mali and Burkina Faso today. So like you have this missionary ideology creates its own perpetuation because it will always mess up local circumstances, mess up the balance of power. Then it says you can't negotiate with anyone.
Yes.
You know, because they're not the right people. They don't have the right belief. And then the situation declines again and you have to supposedly intervene again.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically the pattern we've seen over the past, I don't know, 20, 30 years in many, many places, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And it's perpetuating itself. All right, Chris. I think we're coming to the end of the allotted time, and it's getting, anyways, late where you are. So I'd just like to thank you so much again for joining us and sharing your insights. Thanks a lot.
It's my pleasure.